At the end of my last lecture, I told you we would be taking a look at the Old Kingdom. Well, I lied. Instead, I want to take a closer look at painting and sculpture and try to further explain to you why Egyptian figure art looks the way that it does. Last lecture, I described how Egyptian art focused on eternity instead of mortal life, and how Egyptian artists tried to give visual form to that concept through the consistency and changelessness of the art over the centuries. In this lecture, I plan to present you with a somewhat more philosophical rationale to their approach and what the imagery meant to them. This goes far beyond the usual superficial explanation of Egyptian figurework and hopefully can give you a greater appreciation for what the Egyptian artist was trying to achieve. So, let's get into the minds of the Egyptian artist and see what we can discover lurking there. What I'm going to be taking a look at in today's lecture is painting and sculpture. And what we see here in these two works of art are fairly stereotypical images of the kind of work that the Egyptians created. So last time we talked about kind of the general approach that the Egyptian used in terms of using his artwork to express the changelessness of eternity. But let's delve a little deeper into the rationale, into the mindset of the Egyptian patron and the Egyptian artist to see if we can learn a little bit more about both of these art forms. So we'll start with painting to begin with. Keep in mind that this artwork, strangely enough, was never meant to be seen by any living eye. Virtually all of this, at least the paintings that we look at, virtually all of it was done in the tombs that were built for the pharaohs. And so once the tomb was sealed up, this artwork was sealed into eternal darkness, and no one would ever see it for the rest of eternity for the most part. So it was not meant to appeal to the living eye necessarily, but to the eye of the soul, the Ka, one could say. Therefore, this art is not anecdotal. In other words, it isn't storytelling art, even though oftentimes when art teachers talk about a painting like this, they talk about this representing a day in the marshes with a nobleman and his family hunting for pleasure. Well, maybe he might have enjoyed hunting, probably did, quite frankly, but that's not what this painting is about. It is not storytelling. It's not telling about that day in the marsh. In fact, this artwork is not about life on earth at all for the most part, especially the work that went into the tombs. But what it's about is, as we've discussed already, it's about an eternal existence, the purpose of which was to ensure happiness in the next life. So it wasn't to provide visual enjoyment and storytelling moments in this life. It is about happiness in the next life. So let me take a bit more of a philosophical rationale toward explaining artwork like this. It is so typical of Egyptian painting. I'm going to make a list of things here first and then briefly explain their relevance to their approach. So discard the physical and worldly appearances. Use a composite figure, like we've talked about before. Reject volume. Eliminate movement. Order pattern into static compositions. Organize the picture plane into registers. Now, why do this? You discard physical and worldly appearances in order to reject the world in favor of invoking the eternal. So when we look at artwork like this and criticize it because it doesn't look realistic, keep in mind that the goal of the Egyptian artist was not to create realism, the goal was to reject realism in order to invoke the eternal. Using a composite figure, again, we talked about the characteristics of a composite figure, but why did they do it? Well, again, what you're trying to do is to focus on the most characteristic features, descriptive features of the standard human figure in order to describe the stable essence of the eternal being, not the shifting inconsistencies of optical reality. They wanted something stable, not changeable. And of course, in the real world, every time we move our heads, every time we shift our eyes, every time we look at something from a different point of view, the shape changes. The reality, in a sense, changes. They don't want that shifting inconsistency of the real world. Instead, they're focusing on the stable essence of the eternal world. Now, in terms of rejecting volume, that's simple. They reject volume, well, partly because that's a part of the physical world, but also they don't even attempt to make three-dimensional images, partly because the surface that they're working on is flat. So the question is, why create an illusion that the image that's on that surface is three-dimensional, when the truth of the surface itself is that it's flat? Those of you that have studied 19th century painting are familiar with with artists like Cézanne, where much of his focus was on rejecting the idea of a canvas as a window through which we're looking at the recreated world, and instead respecting the flatness of the picture plane and finding ways to flatten the images in order to respect that flatness. Now, that was a 19th century concept, but I believe that it has a purpose to play here in the 20th century BC among the Egyptians. Now, eliminate movement. Notice everything is very static in Egyptian art. There's no real sense of movement at all. Well, again, the idea here is to celebrate the motionless world of eternal truths, coming back to the eternities again. One characteristic feature of eternity is that it is truth, and that truth never changes. So again, how can you represent that visually? Well, eliminate movement would be one way of doing it in order to celebrate the motionless world of that eternal truth. Truth doesn't move, doesn't change, doesn't shift from position to position. So neither does the artwork that represents it. Order pattern into static compositions. Again, you have to go back time and time again to this concept of eternity. That's why I advised you that at the beginning of the term, that the core principle in understanding Egypt, both in their art and in their architecture, at least the examples that we look at, or that have remained, is the concept of eternity. So here again, order pattern in these images into static compositions in order to assure eternal stability and permanence in terms of the art, what the art represents. And then organize the picture plane into registers, these horizontal zones. I would argue that this is to maintain the truth of an eternal and divinely ordered hierarchy. Okay, in other words, last time we talked about the fact that one of the characteristic features of Egyptian art was hierarchic scale. The most important things are the biggest things in an image, in a picture plane. Now, when you think about the Western way of doing things with linear perspective, the most important things are not necessarily the biggest things. The biggest things are the closest things, whether they're important or not. And so you might have a rather insignificant object in the foreground, which is going to be huge, relatively, and maybe you have a very important individual, a king or a monarch, in the midground, that's smaller by comparison to that unimportant thing. What that is suggesting is that the unimportant thing is actually more important than the important object. The Egyptian doesn't want to suggest that. So he wants to maintain this divinely ordered hierarchy because the people that were important in ancient Egyptian society were important because they were divinely ordained to be so. People that are slaves are destined to be slaves and nothing else. And so that's the truth of a divinely ordered hierarchy in society, and the way that is represented in the imagery is through hierarchic scale. Now, if you abandon that in favor of a linear perspective illusion of depth, then size is based on distance, not importance. Okay? And so in a painting such as the one that we're looking at here, the noble and his wife might be relegated to relatively mid-sized figures, whereas the servants working, plowing the fields in the foreground would be larger than they are. And so that goes contrary to divinely ordered principles. And so in the artwork, that hierarchy must be maintained, and you cannot maintain it using realistic linear perspective approach to the picture plane. So instead you employ this compositional device where the picture plane is divided into registers, and then distance is represented through vertical positioning rather than size. Okay? So the idea in an Egyptian painting with registers is that the things typically that are in the highest registers are those that are the farthest away, and those in the lowest registers are conceived of as being closer. But everything maintains its divinely ordered hierarchy of size. Interesting concept. Now, where did they do most of this painting? Well, for the most part, it's mostly on tomb walls, at least the paintings that have survived. And so we see a couple of examples here. The one that we were looking at originally is a piece of fresco that has been extracted from a tomb. And then on the right side, you're looking at a photograph of an actual tomb interior. So let's look at these two examples to illustrate some of our points here. So first of all, how did they do this artwork? Well, I mentioned, I think, earlier that it's done with fresco. Now, most of you are probably familiar with what true fresco is. The type of fresco that they did during the Renaissance. The type of fresco that Michelangelo does on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That type of fresco is done on damp plaster. So they're using an aqueous medium that's been applied to damp plaster, and then and you can paint on it only while the plaster is damp. And then when the plaster dries, the paint is incorporated chemically into the plaster, so it's very, very permanent. However, the disadvantage is that the artist has to paint quickly because you can only paint while the plaster's damp. As soon as it dries, your painting session is finished. So how did the Egyptians do it? They used what's called fresco secco, dry fresco. And we saw an example of them preparing a wall last lecture, where they're smoothing it down, plastering it, applying the grid, and then drawing the image on that, and then painting that image, just coloring in the outlines basically. So in working in this fashion, the advantage is that it allows for slow, meticulous work. You can detail as much little tiny meticulous elements as you want in your painting. You don't need to hurry because the surface is dry anyway. The disadvantage is that this is a very fragile medium. In other words, paint doesn't stick to plaster very well. And so if it wasn't for the fact that these paintings had been preserved for thousands of years, kind of hermetically sealed basically inside of a tomb environment where the temperature doesn't change, the humidity doesn't change, mold and fungus and these kinds of things don't attack the paintings. If it wasn't for that situation, they wouldn't have lasted. They would have disappeared probably. In fact, when you look at the paintings even that have been preserved, you can see in many cases the plaster beginning to deteriorate, or the painting on the plaster, the color beginning to fade or to fall away from the surface and so on. So it is very fragile, unfortunately. But it has, fortunately, been preserved inside these controlled environments. So here is the painting of the nobleman Nebamun hunting fowl in the marshes with his family. Okay. Now, oftentimes you'll see images of successful hunts in these paintings. And so the question is this just a portrayal of a nobleman on an outing with his family in the marshes, pursuing some enjoyable pastime? And they're always successful hunts, as you can see clearly in this image. The nobleman standing on his reed boat in the lagoon of the marshes, the lagoon filled full of fish and water lilies. He's hunting birds in the papyrus thickets, and the thickets are filled full of all kinds of wild birds, so abundant in fact that he doesn't even have to knock them down out of the air with his throwing stick, which he holds in his hand. He can just reach out and grab them, and they are so abundant. And then he's got his hunting cat, his favorite hunting cat, with him. And that cat is a very capable hunter itself, jaws full of birds, both pairs of claws full of birds. It's a very successful hunt, and the lagoon itself brimming full of fish. So what is the essence of what the artist is trying to communicate with this successful hunt? Well, for the Egyptian, a successful hunt illustrated or symbolized triumph over death and disorder. A very interesting application for this type of subject matter. The fruitful marshes and the brimming lagoon, what is that for? Well, again, abundance and good living in eternity is what it stands for. And then one other thing I wanted to mention here is about the position of the feet. Notice that the position of the wife's feet and the position of the husband's feet are very different. When you look at feet in Egyptian art, both relief sculptures and painting, you'll see that the distance apart that the feet are placed is significant. So in this case, the feet apart, as in the case of the wife, her feet are slightly separated. That represents life. In other words, the feet moving apart represents the fact that that individual can move. And so represents symbolically life. Feet that are wide apart represents action. And so he's hunting, and so he's in the act of performing a physical activity. So his feet are separated quite a ways. And then the feet together, as you see here with Osiris, that typically represents death. Okay? No longer capable of motor function, no longer capable of moving. So death. Now, interestingly enough, and I must admit I don't understand the rationale behind this, but oftentimes that women are portrayed with their feet together as well. Not suggesting that they're dead, I'm pretty sure, but nevertheless that seems to be fairly typical for the way that they're portrayed. Now, perhaps that indicates their lack of physical activity for a well-born woman. I don't know, but nevertheless, oftentimes we'll see it there. But generally speaking, keep in mind, feet together means no more movement, means death. feet apart, whether far apart or slightly separated, means life. Okay? So we'll see further evidences of this a little bit later. Okay, now for the nobleman's tomb. So this is an interior that has been well preserved, as you can see, and is filled full of fresco secco painting. Now we want to look first of all at the side wall here. What this represents, of course, is a nobleman's farm, a very fruitful farm. And again, the fruitful farm can be equated also to the fruitful and abundant marshes. Okay. You can see clearly that the farm life is divided into registers, again, in order to organize the picture plane in the manner that I spoke about earlier. See the nobleman and his wife out supervising the harvest, very industrious workers working throughout the farm, helping to bring in the harvests and create an abundant lifestyle for the man and his wife. Now remember, this is relating to, hopefully they had a fruitful farm in life, but the purpose of this tomb painting, which would never be seen by anyone, is to assure that same fruitfulness and abundance in the next life. That's what this is all about. Okay? And then we've got, as I indicated earlier, these registers not only organize the picture plane, but indicate spatial depth. So the figures in the topmost register are conceived of as being further away than the figures in the lower register. Now, I don't know how strictly you can apply that to every single scene that you see in Egyptian art that contains registers, but that's a general concept. Another point I want to make here, as long as we've got these two figures on the screen, is a convention that the Egyptian artists used to indicate gender. Okay? Now you'll typically see figures that are dark and figures that are light. Males are always dark, and the women are always lighter. Now this is not a convention that's just typical or restricted to the Egyptians, but virtually every ancient culture up until we get to the era where we start getting more realistic kind of portrayals, virtually every ancient culture used that convention. And most scholars believe that it's associated with the day-to-day activities of these two gender types. Males being out of doors, working out in the hot sun, getting tanned during their lifetimes, whereas a genteel, noble woman, she doesn't go out and work in the fields, of course. She instead stays at home and so doesn't suffer the effects of exposure to the sun, outdoor life. Now, that certainly can be considered to be true of a nobleman's wife, but when you see any females being depicted in Egyptian art, they're always lighter skinned, oftentimes painted yellow. Has nothing to do with ethnicity or race. It's just a conventional way of representing an outdoor lifestyle as opposed to indoor lifestyle. And so even when you have slave women out working in the fields, they typically are light colored as well, because it just becomes eventually a conventional way of representing females versus males. So what we have here, of course, is this very abundant working farm, which doesn't represent probably in reality the actual farm. Hopefully it did, but not necessarily. What it represents is the abundance and good life that would be expected in the afterlife, and paintings like this are intended to ensure it. And then in the image on the end wall, the image on the right, what you see there in the center is a portal. This is a painted portal that was believed to lead, was a doorway into the next life, into the afterlife. And then around the portal, you see in those registers kneeling worshipers or slaves bringing offerings in honor of the deceased before the portal to pass through the portal as an offering to the deceased on the other side. And when you think about the registers here, it's interesting to think that this would represent 3 pairs of slaves, let's say, kneeling before the doorway in 3 rows, one before the other. So the slaves at the top would be the ones in front of the door, then these guys behind them, and then these guys behind them. So kind of an indication of depth in that way. So this is just a painted version of it. Here's one that's been carved into a tomb, and these are just false doorways, of course, but the intention, the belief is that they led into the afterlife. Here's one that's rather interesting, much more elaborate, needless to say, with the deceased actually passing through the doorway. So these were common features in tombs, of course. Now, when an artist, in terms of subject matter, when an artist was painting the upper class or royalty, upper strata of society, they were pretty much required to stick to convention, the conventions that we've been taking a look at so far. But they were allowed greater freedom when working with the lower class or when creating images of the lower class, as we see here. And perhaps the rationale for that is their eternal nature was less critical, so you didn't have to conform to the conventions and the restrictions and the canon quite so much. And so what we see here are female musicians at a feast, typically, and in this fresco, the partygoers, the attendees at the feast are portrayed above them, outside the picture plane here. But the thing that I want you to pay attention to with this painting is 2 very interesting features. And that is, when you look at the two rightmost musicians, notice that we see a very unusual breaking of convention with those 2 ladies. Okay, so what we see here is a very rare frontal facial portrayal. The other 2 are done conventionally, but those 2 are done with this very rare frontal portrayal. Makes you wonder who this artist was, and did his patron approve of it, to be a little adventurous, to break with convention here a little bit, try something new? Who knows? No one, we will never know. But again, if somebody did want to try something unconventional, remember, nobody's going to see it other than other workers while it was being prepared, because once this tomb is sealed, then that influence isn't going to travel beyond this particular tomb, and it doesn't seem to. The other thing is the slave girls. Notice these 2 young girls in the nude on the right-hand side of the image. There's nothing stiff and static about those young ladies. They are engaged in a very sinuous dance with the bodies curving and twisting and bending. You'll never see that with a pharaoh and his wife or any other nobleman, right? And so this is an indication of lower class, just as the experiment with the faces probably is. So a very interesting treatment of lower class individuals, where the Egyptian artist was allowed greater freedom because the eternal nature of those people was not dependent upon a proper portrayal of the imagery. And then the other thing is nudity. These young girls are clearly identifiable as slaves because in Egypt and in much of the ancient world, in fact, nudity was always an indication of slavery or very low class. Now, with that in mind, it's interesting to consider what the Greeks did, because with the Greeks, they reversed that approach, in that even the gods themselves were nude, right? As well as the heroes and great figures of their sculptures. They were done typically in the nude. Now, this is very unusual, of course, in the ancient world. And typically when you see figures that are nude, that would be an indication of their status as slaves. Now, the other thing that I want to make mention of here is that just like what you will see with many other paintings featuring females, and that is what these ladies are wearing on their heads. And this might be considered deodorant in a sense. I mean, I'm exaggerating there, but basically what these were cones of beeswax that were saturated with scented honey and fragrances. You see the golden color at the top of those cones. The cone, of course, has been tied onto the head, and then as the evening wears on, those cones slowly melt, thus dispensing the fragrance down over the hair and over the shoulders of the individuals. So that would make sense here at a hot party where the temperatures rise and the girls are busy playing their music. But we see that also here in that hunting scene of Nibamun. His wife also is wearing that same cone. So a fairly typical device that the Egyptian woman wore, apparently. All right, now let's take a look at sculpture. Now in this case, we're looking at three-dimensional sculpture rather than relief. So this isn't truly freestanding, since it is relief also, but it's a very high relief. So what we want to look at here is the anatomy of a god as portrayed in these sculptures by the Egyptian artist. So first of all, as I've mentioned numerous times, these are universal images, not intended to look like real life, but rather an idealized universal representation. As I mentioned, the sculpture is considered to be high relief, but it's a closed high relief. In other words, it's almost like freestanding sculpture, except for the fact that it is attached to a block of stone. Therefore, it isn't truly freestanding in the sense of a Greek statue standing upon a pedestal outside of a temple. Okay, so you can clearly see the block of stone between the two individuals, binding them into its matrix. And so this entire sculpture would have been created from a single block of granite and then carved away to reveal the figures still attached to that matrix of stone. So a closed high relief. Open sculpture would be where you have open spaces between the legs or between the bodies here, between the arm and the torso and so on. A more realistic portrayal. Another thing that is fairly typical of Egyptian figure sculpture is it's very formal. Typically, at least when you're dealing with the upper classes. That's different when you're dealing with the lower classes and slave groups, because you do see representations of those. But when you're dealing with this level of society, it's always very formal. And there's a nobility about the figures, okay? That is unquestionable. These are not people of low class, for certain. There's a nobility about them, and their very demeanor and aspect bespeaks that. Also, you notice in every case, except for very brief periods of time that we'll talk about in later lectures, these faces are always emotionless. No attempt here at trying to capture the happiness or sadness of the human being. They're very frontal as well, always facing toward us, never turning or twisting or bending. Not like those little slave girls. That's never going to happen with a pharaoh and his wife. And so always very frontal. And again, static. They've got their foot moved forward. Their left foot is striding forward, but otherwise very static and locked into place with the hands stiffly held at the sides. So the reasons for these, the rationale, the universality, of course, as we've talked about several times, represents the unchanging ideal of the eternities, and in the case of a pharaoh, of a god on earth. The closed high relief, that basically represents the fact that they're locked into eternity, into this matrix of stone. The formality, what we see here are these figures staring straight ahead, not acknowledging anything to the left nor right, above or below, but just straight ahead, above the heads of mere mortals, ignoring the travails of common man as they stride forward through life and into the eternities. Noble demeanor is a clear indication that they are neither low-born nor common. Emotionless, similar to the formality, they are impervious to whatever affects ordinary man. Now, in reality, of course, they were not that way. We're talking about pharaohs. They suffered emotional distress and anger and happiness just like every human being does. But we're not trying to represent with these figures the man that sits on the throne. Instead, you're representing the concept of pharaoh-ness, right? Godhood, albeit a minor god, a god nevertheless, impervious to whatever affects ordinary men. And this frontality, they're basically facing into the eternities as they walk through life. Static, kind of caught between, notice that they are static, but they've got the one foot forward. And it's always the left foot, by the way, okay, when you see in a sculpture. When you're looking at a painting, they always have a foot forward, but it's always the far foot. So if they're facing right, then it's the left foot that's forward. If they're facing left, then it's the right foot that's forward. It's always the back foot. But in sculptures like we see here, it's always the left foot. And the argument for that is, the justification for that is, that the heart is on the left side of the body. And so by moving the left foot forward, it symbolizes the connection with the heart, the activity of the heart, the fact that the heart is alive and moving and active. But in any case, they got that foot moved forward, and so but they're not moving, they're static. And so in a sense, they're caught between rest and movement. In other words, beings of another world, for the most part, the stillness of eternity being represented in this stance. And then with the hands at the sides, notice that in the hands they typically hold dowels. And so scholars believe that they are gripping royal seals, signs of their authority. And we'll come back a little bit later on to the beard, because the beard also is a sign of royal authority for the pharaohs. But we'll talk about that later. Now be aware that, and this is a little bit contrary to what I've been talking about here in terms of not representing life on earth and not representing a lifelike quality. Nevertheless, you can't always categorically apply these rules to everything. You can't overthink the rationale and the logic behind everything and consistency, because you can always find loopholes like this one. So most sculptures like these two, this prince and his wife from his tomb, most sculptures were painted like these figures in order to make them look more lifelike. Why, when they were rejecting lifelike qualities, I can't explain, but nevertheless, most sculptures are painted to make them seem more lifelike. But most pharaonic sculptures were left unpainted like this one of the pharaoh Khafre, in order to enhance a sense of timelessness. And you have to agree, I think, that color adds a sense of time, because it's time-bound with reality. On the other hand, where you've got a colorless image, that conveys a sense of timelessness, again, because it isn't linked to reality and it doesn't deteriorate, doesn't change, and so on. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Egyptian artist was allowed greater realism when he was permitted to work with lower classes, like those musician ladies or like these scribes. Now, this has kind of a startling sense of reality when you look at especially at the face of this individual. Almost has a personality when you're looking at this individual. Made of limestone, he's a seated scribe. He's in the process of writing on his tablet there, and then painted to look lifelike. And you can see the kohl around the eyes here clearly depicted. But this is a lower class individual. He's not royal, he's a commoner. So the artist can work with him in a more realistic sort of way. And it belies the fact that most people believe that the Egyptian couldn't create a realistic image. Now this one's only moderately realistic, but this one also captures a sense of reality, both in the sagging muscles and chest muscles and ribs and protruding belly and so on. And that rather ascetic-looking, bony face. There's a real sense of character and personality that comes through in this individual. And so those are examples of the fact that Egyptian artists could work realistically, were they given the training and the opportunity to do so. But this one is really remarkable in the fact that of the realism that comes through in this face. I would suspect that most people who were presented with this image would not identify it as Egyptian, but it has been recovered from the workshop of an Egyptian sculptor. So it shows that given the opportunity and the proper training, Egyptian sculptors could work fairly realistically and with sensitivity to the form. So one thing to keep in mind, and this is true not just of Egypt, but throughout history, when you think about it, realism in art increases as social importance decreases. Okay, so you can see that even in much later period of time, when royalty is oftentimes portrayed as being somewhat ideal and beautiful and heroic, and perhaps not exactly the way they would have actually looked, as opposed to commoners being represented in a very realistic manner. It basically bespeaks their position in society. The royal are noble and heroic. Think of any other period in history, and this typically is true. Whereas those of a lower status, they're often dealt with not ideally, as ideal figures, but rather as who they really were. So realism increases as social importance decreases. I'd like you to keep that principle in mind as in one of our later lectures, we look at where the royal artwork will go contrary to that principle. Okay, so now at the risk of just beating a dead horse, I would like to identify some of the specifically pharaonic characteristics of royal sculpture and talk a little bit about their meaning here. So we've got a close-up view of the pharaoh Khafre and the pharaoh sitting on his throne. So again, beating this idea of the universal image into your heads, because this is so typical of the Egyptian approach to this social level of art, universal image. The pharaoh typically portrayed always with a flawless body and a perfect face, and then certainly exudes a sense of serenity in that facial expression. No pain, no suffering, but no happiness and joy there either. Total serenity and contemplation. And then, of course, the whole figure, very, very compact, locked into a block of stone. And just like the other sculptures we've talked about, no movement here. And of course, the feet are together because it's just the way that you sit on a throne, I suspect. And then we've got the beard. Be aware that this is a false beard. Egyptians apparently were a clean-shaven, beardless people. Whether that was convention or whether that was DNA, I don't know. But nevertheless, they are always portrayed in their images as being clean-shaven, which is interesting because that's one way of identifying foreigners, that they always have beards. But in the case of the pharaoh, that's a false beard that he's wearing. A beard that would have been attached to the head with a strap, and then the strap would be hidden with the headdress. Okay. So the universal image, what the meaning of these characteristics are: the universal image, eternal nature of kingship, the flawless body and perfect face, a godlike ideal, serenity, absolutely confident in their power as pharaoh and as minor deity. Compactness certainly promotes the idea of the pharaoh's invulnerability as a social status in his social position. The fact that there's no movement here, eternal stillness, like we've talked about several times before, and then the false beard, a symbol of kingship. So again, they would wear the false beard, probably not daily, but certainly on in periods of celebration or commemoration, dedication of temples and these kinds of things, official moments, they would wear the false beard as a symbol of their kingship. Now, you'll see this later on in another lecture, and you may be somewhat familiar with it already, and that was such a powerful symbol that later on, when a woman became pharaoh, she also wore the false beard on ceremonial occasions and is portrayed wearing one in her artwork. So by contrast, not a pharaoh here, right? And that's clearly obvious. But let's just, to make sure you get the point, let's just investigate this a little bit. So if you were presented with these two images and didn't know who they were, how could you tell what their social status was? What are the characteristics that you would identify? You might just say, well, yeah, that's a pharaoh. He's obvious, and the other guy's he's not. The other guy's more common. But what are the characteristics that you're looking at in order to identify that? So let's just go through those. So how you tell what their social status is based on the imagery that the artist creates here. So the guy on the left, he is seated on a throne. The guy on the right, he's seated on the ground. Now you can well imagine that the guy on the right would never be seated on a throne, and the guy on the left would never be sitting on the ground. Perfect anatomy for the guy on the left. The guy on the right, flabby and aged looking. Unpainted for the fellow on the left. Lifelike color for the fellow on the right. And then finally, universal imagery, the idealized form on the left, and realistic imagery on the right. So what does each of those imply? Seated on a throne, this is a monarch. Seated on the ground, a servant. Perfect anatomy, godlike on the left. On the right, human frailty. On the left, unpainted timelessness. On the right, lifelike color, earthbound. And universal imagery, changeless. And realism, changeable. It deteriorates. It gets worse with time, basically. It gets flabbier and weaker and more frail. And that's typical of earth life, okay, as opposed to the concept of the pharaoh in his godlike status. So, royalty and commoner, yay, we got it. We made a proper guess to begin with. Okay, now just going to wrap this up with take a look real quickly just at the 4 poses that that convention allowed the pharaoh to be placed in. Okay, so we've already seen the life pose, okay, where the figure is taking that striding step forward, the left leg linked to the heart, indicating the heart is alive and capable of movement and action. We just saw the second one here, the royal pose, the pharaoh seated on his throne. And then I said that the pharaoh would never be portrayed on the ground, but this is one instance where that was acceptable. And that's where he's kneeling before his God with tokens in his hands. Because Pharaoh would kneel before no one other than someone greater than himself, and the only entities that were greater than the Pharaoh is God himself, or the gods themselves. So this is the devotion pose, and he's holding tokens in his hands. And then you can perhaps guess what the last one is. The Pharaoh is standing with his arms crossed over his chest. This is the royal pose that mummies would be placed in a tomb. And then if you look at the feet, they are together. So no more life, no more movement. So this is the death pose. These are the 4 poses in which the artists were allowed to portray pharaohs. Okay, then my final bit here is bringing some of these concepts together in what might be referred to as a ritual death. So Egyptian iconoclasm. You can see in the image on the left, this is a carving from a temple column. You can see a pharaoh and a god, pharaoh to the left and a god on the right. And you notice that in both cases, in particular the pharaoh, I want to focus on here, notice that there has been damage done to the figure. Now this is not a consequence of vandalism. This is deliberate action taken by some pharaoh that succeeds this fellow and is an action taken in order to achieve certain goals. And when you look at the image on the right, you see a bit of a temple column and wall structure here. And if you look closely, you can see that the cartouches have been damaged and the images, the hieroglyphs gouged out. So what's the purpose here? Well, we want to talk about the reasons why, and this is true, I believe, not only of the Egyptians, but also of many ancient cultures again. So in the ancient world, the thing that you need to understand, and that is hard for us to, as modern, scientifically based individuals, it's hard for us to understand, is that in the ancient world, the essence of an individual inhabited the image of them. So a portrait wasn't just a portrait of the individual. It's not just a lifeless statue. That portrait was the individual in essence. And somehow the portrait is linked to the person, either living or dead, in the case of the image that you see there on the left. So the image was the individual in some indefinable sort of way that you and I don't really understand or appreciate today. So in the words of a scholar, an Egyptian statue was the meeting point between the supernatural and this world. And as such, it contained the essence of the individual somehow within its form. Now here's an example that some of you may be familiar with from art history survey course, and that is looking at Akkadian art of the Mesopotamian Valley. You see this beautiful bronze or copper sculpture of Sargon the Great, the world's first great emperor. And what we talk about when we look at this, in addition to just the beauty of the sculpture, is the damage that has been done to it, the vandalism that has been done to the sculpture. Of course, the eyes have been gouged out. The end of the nose has been cut off. The ears, you can't see them very well, but the ears have been sliced off. And the bottom of the beard has been cut off. So the question is why was that vandalism perpetrated upon this beautiful sculpture? And the answer to that is related to the statements that I've just made about the image being the individual in some indefinable sort of way. So the damage to the sculpture was committed on this piece after Sargon was long dead, a century after his death. So what would be the point of doing that? Well, another thing to keep in mind is that among many ancient cultures, in order to qualify for rule, kings had to be physically whole. So one way to prevent a king, let's say a king is captured on the battlefield, and there's no need to kill him, to execute him, in order to prevent him from ever regaining his rule again or regaining his throne, because all you had to do was mutilate him, and that rendered him unfit to rule. So slicing off the nose was a favorite method for doing that, or gouge out an eye, or cut off an ear. Do any of those kinds of things, and you prevent the king physically in this world from ever being able to mount a throne again. And so in this particular case, keeping that in mind, as well as the statements on the right of the screen, why was this sort of thing perpetrated on the sculpture of Sargon after his death? Well, must have been in order to prevent him from ruling where? In the afterlife. So now if we look at the Egyptian sculpture, we can get the same idea. Look at what parts of the body have been damaged. We have erased the head, erased the hands, erased the feet, and erased the name in the cartouches to the right. Now what's the purpose of that? Well, when you erase the head, if that image is you, it erases your ability to see, to breathe, to eat, to think, all those types of things that's associated with the head. Now, of course, this pharaoh was in the afterlife, so it's erasing his ability to see, breathe, eat, and think in the afterlife. Why would you erase the hands? Erase his ability to make offerings to the gods as he should and as is proper in the afterlife. Can't do that any longer. Why erase the feet? Well, you might be able to relate this to what we talked about earlier with the painting of Nibamun. Erase the feet, you prevent him from being able to move, right? Erase the ability to move or act. So, again, prevent him from being able to act in his appointed position in the afterlife. And then, of course, when you erase the hieroglyphs in the cartouche, you're erasing the name. And when you do that, you're basically erasing his identity, erasing who he is. In the ancient world, unlike today, I mean today even, when people misuse our names, we're offended by it, typically. But in the ancient world, the name is who you were. That's why in the case of the Hebrews never knew the name of their deity, because to know the name of the deity, the official true name of the deity, would be to gain power over that being, that individual, and perhaps to do damage to it or to disrespect it on a level that was unheard of. And so you simply don't reveal your true name, you give them an alternate name. In the case of the Hebrews, their alternate name was Yahweh, or as we interpret it, Jehovah. It's not his real name. No one knows his real name. And that's one of the interesting things about the Hebrews, is that they were never allowed to write his real name in the scriptures. So they always used the abbreviation for the name Yahweh. So that's kind of interesting aspect of this idea of identity and revealing one's name, keeping it secret, and keeping it only among those people that you most trust. Okay, so that is our look at painting and sculpture. And next class, I promise, we'll take a look at the Old Kingdom. So I'll talk to you then.